SharePoint is an interesting platform that includes many elements. Most of us are at least a little familiar with some of them, primarily the concept of folders and file structure and the use of web pages. While it's very similar to some things we already know, it's also a bit different. If you understand how SharePoint fits into your computer system, what it potentially can contain, and how that all fits together, it will help you use it more easily. It's like traveling to a new city or country and trying to find your way around versus having a map that you've looked at beforehand, so you know how things are laid out and related to one another. We want you to have a good SharePoint map to refer to as you begin on your journey. Exactly how SharePoint fits into your specific network is a complex question, and it's one that I can't answer. No two SharePoint implementations are the same, and exactly how they're designed depends on many factors, many options, and many variables. These things are carefully planned and implemented by those who put SharePoint into place for you, probably your IT team. What we do know for sure is that there are a variety of network components that must be in place for SharePoint to work. These include things like Windows servers, Exchange servers, SharePoint servers, Active Directory, and possibly more. You probably use Windows Server and Active Directory when you log onto your business computer. This is where your user account or profile is stored. It's what knows if you're allowed to log on to the network and what resources you should have access to. You may also use Exchange Server if you get your email in Outlook. It's the Microsoft Communications and Email server. And of course, SharePoint that you'll be using has to be hosted on something, like all websites are hosted, and that usually is some form of a SharePoint server. We don't have to worry about all of those details. Just know that they're working in the background. As a user of SharePoint, you'll be coming into the actual SharePoint sites. All SharePoint sites contain either subsites or lists and libraries. A SharePoint site that is at the very top level, like a folder that sits right on your C drive, is called a top-level site. It's a site, just like all other sites, but it just happens to sit at the top of the structure. This top-level site can have any number of subsites or lists and libraries. In a small organization, there may be only one top-level site, and all the data might be in lists and libraries right below this top-level site. You will need to be able to navigate to the specific list or library that you need. That data may be at the first, second, third, or any other number of levels. In most larger organizations, there will be multiple top-level sites in SharePoint, and each of those top-level sites may have one or more levels of subsites below them. A top-level site and all of its structure below, its subsites, its lists, and its libraries are called a site collection. If you're in HR, you may access the HR site collection. If you're in sales, sales may have their own site collection. Sometimes these are organized geographically, so you may be in the Boston site collection or the LA site collection. The point is, there can be many top-level sites, and each top-level site is considered a site collection, and it contains all of the content in the levels below it. In large organizations, there can be thousands of sites and many levels of information. But if we remember that for each site, it can only have subsites and lists or libraries, and that data is only in lists and libraries, it doesn't matter how complex the entire structure is. We only need to be concerned with the site that we are currently working in. That structure never gets more complicated. There are an unlimited number of potential configurations and use case scenarios that can be handled within SharePoint. Yours will be unique, but if you remember the basic structure never changes, it will all make sense and be easier to use. So as a review, remember, a top-level site is the one that sits at the top of the structure. You will probably come into a top-level site at some point, but you may also simply enter SharePoint at one of the subsites. It doesn't really matter, because subsites and workspaces are used to organize and secure content, but they are sites, just like the top-level site. And each site contains lists and libraries, and those are what are used to store the actual data that you'll be accessing. Either data records like contacts or calendar items, or actual files like Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. And if you ever hear the word site collection, and honestly you may not, just know that that is the top-level site and all of its content. What you now know is actually an awful lot. Some may say they don't need to know how SharePoint is structured in order to use it, or what the parts can contain. To a point, they may be right. But like traveling to a new country or city, while we can probably find what we need without any frame of reference, it's not going to be nearly as easy, intuitive, or efficient as it would be if we had an overview. maybe even a map to look at before we arrived. So here's our map or our overview. SharePoint is not a single thing. It's a collection of features and services, and you will probably continue to hear me say that over and over because it's really important to remember. We also need to remember that no two SharePoint implementations are ever the same, so don't compare what you're doing to what your friend or your spouse is doing in their company. They're always going to be different. There are a variety of servers and services that run behind the scenes. Fortunately, we do not have to care about those. They're usually handled by some other type of administrator. As a user, all you need to know is how to access your SharePoint site using a web browser. All SharePoint sites start with a top-level site. Some may have only a top-level site, but they may have more than one top-level site as well. That's going to depend on your particular configuration. Each top-level site will have any number of subsites, lists, and/or libraries contained within it. Subsites are like top-level sites. They contain also just subsites, lists, and libraries. Don't make it any harder than it has to be. To find actual information, you need to be able to locate the site, then the list or library that contains the information you want. So there's your map, and now you know what to expect. I can guarantee that trying to do SharePoint without having this little bit of background information will be more stressful and uncomfortable. We don't want either of those. You now have that overview, so you'll be able to understand what's happening and even a little bit about how it's happening as you begin to navigate your way through SharePoint sites.